What are the Great Ones? It's a question we've probably all asked ourselves at some point. Rightfully so. The Great Ones are one of the most mysterious, difficult to grasp parts of Bloodborne's lore. In terms of the in-game lore, Great Ones are powerful cosmic beings with their own unique physical manifestations. But Great Ones have a completely different meaning within the context of the extra game lore and the Victorian medical metaphor that we've been following throughout this series. In this episode, we'll approach the Great Ones from a completely new angle, and in the process, we'll gain our own version of Eyes on the Inside. In order to wrap our heads around the Great Ones, it helps to lay out as much basic evidence as possible. We need to first establish what we know, and second, what we can logically infer. For the latter task, it's crucial to find the common threads between these creatures. This video is the first in a two-part episode about the Great Ones. For this installment, I've chopped up the video into two main sections. In section 1, we'll examine the text of the game, the item descriptions, lore notes, and runes that most clearly identify the Great Ones. This will serve as an essential foundation. In section 2, we'll shift our focus to the visual or aesthetic characteristics that we can observe of the Great Ones. There's a feature that we've just missed or downplayed that I believe is the single most important factor in understanding how the Great Ones fit into the game's narrative and metaphor. In the second installment of this two-part episode, which I'll release in just a few days, we'll do two things. One, we'll break down the concept of insight and how it works as both a game mechanic and a narrative mechanic that bridges the Great Ones and the medical metaphor. And two, we'll combine all of these elements from both episodes, which will allow us to make several dramatic conclusions about the true nature of the Great Ones and their connection to the broader narrative of the game. This is where the in-game lore and the extra game lore converge. Before we can confidently answer the question, what is a Great One, we need to start with a more basic question. Who is a Great One? This is a controversial topic, so we're going to do our best to avoid speculation and just rely on the facts. There are surprisingly few creatures we encounter or learn about that we can say with absolute certainty are Great Ones. For this examination, we're not going to bother with things like PlayStation trophy descriptions, old Reddit threads, or long-held beliefs. We're just going to look at the materials within the game. Let's go through the list of confirmed Great Ones. We encounter the amygdala creatures, primarily the lesser amygdalae, in many places of Bloodborne, from the exterior of Udden Chapel to the gateway to Yahar'gul and the building walls of the Unseen Village. Then, of course, there's the boss of the Nightmare Frontier, which we're led to believe is a greater or major amygdala. How do we know that the amygdala is a Great One? Fortunately, we get confirmation from an item, the amygdalan arm. The weapon is described simply as the arm of a small amygdala Great One. We don't have to do any mental gymnastics to figure this out. The weapon tells us in no uncertain terms that the amygdala is a Great One. We find the brain of Mensis, naturally, in the Nightmare of Mensis, where it inflicts frenzy on us until we can finally send it plunging into the darkness at the bottom of the Nightmare Fortress. If we kill the brain of Mensis, we obtain the unique ritual material, the Living String. The text for the Living String is unequivocal. The immense brain that Mensis retrieved from the Nightmare was a legitimate Great One. Same as with the amygdala, an item description tells us in plain language that the brain of Mensis is a Great One. Udden, in my belief, is the greatest mystery of the entire game. We never see or hear Udden, at least that we know of, which seems to be From Software's intent. But two rune descriptions give us indisputable proof that Udden is a Great One. The Formless Udden rune is most explicit, stating, "The Great One, Udden, lacking form, exists only in voice, and is symbolized by this rune." Meanwhile, both the Formless Udden rune and the Udden Writhe rune include the statement, "Human or not, the oozing blood is a medium of the highest grade, and the essence of the Formless Great One." Udden is a Great One without question. Within a cavern beneath the Grand Cathedral, we find Abritus, daughter of the cosmos. Although no item or rune description gives us a straightforward testament as to the Great One's status of Abritus, the combined text of two items allows us to easily make this assertion. The Augur of Abritus and the choir set together overwhelmingly indicate she's a Great One. The Augur refers to her as abandoned Abritus, while the choir set says, together with the left-behind Great One, the choir looked to the skies in search of astral signs that may lead them to the rediscovery of true greatness. The description of the Great Eyes Chalice states that the Eyes Chalice was the first great chalice brought back to the surface since the time of Byrgenwerth, and allowed the choir to have audience with Abritus. We can deduce that abandoned Abritus, mentioned in the Augur, is the left-behind Great One mentioned in the choir set. The terms left behind and abandoned are virtually synonymous, but the linkage of the choir and Abritus, who is mentioned by name in the Eyes Chalice description, as well as the linkage of the choir and the left-behind Great One in the choir set description, allows us to make the most minor of inferences that Abritus is a Great One. We are in no way making a major leap here. Believe it or not, these four beings are the only ones for whom we receive explicit confirmation about their status as a Great One. If you're an avid viewer of lore videos on YouTube or a reader of the thousands of Reddit or other message board threads about Bloodborne, you know that most players assume that there are 9 Great Ones. In addition to the 4 figures we've just discussed, the list would include the Moon Presence, Kaz, the Orphan of Kaz, Murgo, and Murgo's wet nurse. Further, there's some dispute about whether Rom, the One Reborn, the Celestial Emissary, and the Living Failures are Great Ones, although I think it's fair to say the large majority of players don't think that this latter group includes any Great Ones. But before we make up our minds, let's establish a new paradigm for determining which creatures are Great Ones. If we can't rely on the game's text to disclose every Great One, we need to look for other evidence. There should be some sort of commonality or criteria that'll help us solve this mystery. Fortunately, the criterion exists, and it's one we can observe with our own 2 eyes. Let's look again at our confirmed Great Ones. The brain of Mensis is by far the most important figure for our understanding of the Great Ones. That's because there's no mystery about this creature. Its name tells us that it's a brain. The creature drops the living string, which tells us plainly that it's an immense brain. And even if we didn't have this information, we don't need eyes on the inside to tell us so. We can simply look at it and determine that it's obviously an immense brain. This isn't a random design choice by From Software. The brain of Mensis is a thing found within the body for a reason, as we'll begin to see. Ever since we first learned the name of this creature in 2015, most players were quick to make the logical connection between the name of the amygdala Great One and the amygdala, a part of the brain with the exact same spelling but different pronunciation. This is common knowledge by now, and dozens of threads on internet forums have detailed these connections. I won't rehash those, other than to say that the amygdala is an almond-shaped feature of the brain that gets its name from the Latin word for almond. It's involved in emotional memory and decision-making, and activation of the area can cause extreme emotional response, fear, and paranoia. The monstrous head of the amygdala Great One is also almond-shaped, and the identical naming allows us to conclude that this Great One, like the brain of Mensis, is also directly inspired by something found within the body. It's widely understood that the name Abritus seems to be drawn from the word inebriation or drunkenness. That makes sense in the game Bloodborne, in which blood drunkenness plays an important role. But Abritus also is the name of a genus of butterfly. This factoid proves exceptionally helpful in understanding the design of Abritus, whose body is modeled upon the trachea, or much of the bronchial tree, and whose head is based upon the thyroid. Why do I say that? The thyroid is commonly referred to as a butterfly-shaped gland in the back of the throat. This is where Abritus's name as a genus of butterfly clues us in. We can see that the bluish flaps on the side of Abritus's head match the lobes of the thyroid gland. I understand if it's hard to visualize Abritus as a massive trachea, and I think that's by design. For most of the boss fight, Abritus leans forward. Her posture hides the fact that her face is actually the opening of the throat or the larynx. When she performs her version of A Call Beyond, she stands straight up and we can see her true physiognomy, which is much like the trachea. If we examine the rest of her body, we can see that her tentacles appear to represent the larger bronchi leading to the lungs, while her wings are the tiny bronchioles that web their way through the lungs. Just as with the brain of Mensis and the amygdala, Abritus, who was designed as a monstrous depiction of the trachea and thyroid, is something found within the body. So, of the 4 creatures that the in-game text confirms with absolute certainty are Great Ones, 3 are depicted as things found within the human body. The visual and naming clues are incontrovertible. The 4th Great One from our initial list, unfortunately, is a figure we can't put to this same test. Udin, as we saw from the runes bearing his name, is formless. We never see a physical manifestation of him, as he exists only in voice. This doesn't mean our anatomy criterion is invalid, though. It just implies that Udin is somehow unique. We'll return to him later. We can thus operate with a working and so far sound theory. The Great Ones, from a design perspective, should resemble oversized versions of things found within the human body. Let's circle back to our list of possible Great Ones and see which of them seem to pass this test. Let's begin with our least likely candidates and work our way through the list. The living failures encountered at the top of the research hall in the Hunter's Nightmare aren't referenced in any items or dialogue in the game. If we're going to consider them Great Ones, we need some other piece of evidence to help us make that call. With this enemy, we find none. The living failures' appearance is almost a hybrid of the celestial minions and the research patients, which is important to note. We'll return to this point later. Although the living failures have a humanoid appearance in their bodies and extremities, their heads are much like the amorphous sacks that serve as the heads of the research patients. There's no distinctive feature of their heads that would grab our attention, and nothing I've been able to pin down that would serve as a representation of an organ or internal system of the body. There's more to say about this judgment call, but I'll wait and make a more summative conclusion at the end of this 2-part episode. Much like the living failures, the One Reborn isn't mentioned by name or even hinted at in any of the game's text. But does the One Reborn check our design box? No, it doesn't. The One Reborn appears as a horrific fusion of bodies and body parts, mainly limbs, torsos, and heads whose flesh has been peeled away. Yes, these are body parts, but they're not things found within the body. That's the key distinction. And as we discussed earlier, our confirmed Great Ones are designed primarily, if not entirely, as things found within the body. The One Reborn has no distinctive shape or feature that would lead us to conclude it's a representation of some internal organ or system. If our design theory is correct, then the One Reborn doesn't appear to be a Great One. The Celestial Emissary that we find in the Lumenflower Garden is essentially a gigantic version of the Celestial Minions that we find many places throughout Bloodborne. As with the Living Failures, the Emissary possesses a humanoid torso and limbs, but its head is its unique feature. And just like the head of the Living Failures, the head of the Celestial Emissary offers us nothing that would evoke an internal organ or system. It's fairly nondescript. Again, if our design theory is correct, then the Celestial Emissary doesn't appear to be a Great One. In my observation, Rom remains one of the most disputed figures in the Great One debate. People argue passionately that Rom is or is not a Great One. At a glance, Rom doesn't appear to be much more than a blob with tiny legs. It's not surprising that many players jokingly refer to Rom as a potato. Mikolash suggests Rom might be a Great One in his line, As you once did for the vacuous Rom, grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy. This indicates that Rom has elevated her thoughts to that of a great one, but that's a whole other line of analysis. Let's just focus on our design theory for now. Does Rom meet our criteria? I don't believe so. Although Rom is referred to as a spider, her form is much more like that of a butterfly or moth in its chrysalis stage. A hawk moth, for example, has a sort of hook or tail that it uses to hang from plants or thin branches when it's in its pupa stage. Rom's tail might represent this sort of hook. Based on what we know about Abritus and her butterfly or moth-like design influences, Rom as an undeveloped butterfly or moth might be From Software's design intent, but otherwise she doesn't appear to meet our design criteria. The moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates, otherwise known as Paleblood, as we know is the true final boss of the game. Although we never receive direct evidence in the game's text that the moon presence is a great one, it's almost universally accepted that Paleblood is indeed a great one. Some will argue that dream or nightmare realms are attached to a particular great one, and Paleblood inhabits the hunter's dream. Therefore, it must be a great one. That makes sense, I suppose, but I'd argue there's better evidence that Paleblood is a great one if we simply examine this creature through the lens of our medical metaphor and the design criteria that we've established. When we do that, we can say with virtual certainty that Paleblood is a great one. The moon presence appears as a stylized depiction of the circulatory system, mainly the major venous pathways of the aorta. Its four long tentacles, for lack of a better term, are meant to depict the femoral arteries and the great saphenous veins of the legs. The part of Paleblood's body that's mystified players is its head, which appears to be completely alien and tilted sideways. If we're able to view Paleblood from just the right angle, we can see that it isn't really a head at all. It's more like a face that's been created by way of a cross-sectional slice. Notice the incredibly straight edge here. To me, this indicates that Paleblood's face is likely the bottom of the heart, or possibly where the aortic trunk would connect to the heart. It's hard to say. We can see here that the tentacles coming off of what appear to be its head are actually coming out of the aortic trunk and could represent the carotid, vertebral, and subclavian arteries. In any case, my best guess is that the face is meant to represent a transverse cross-section of the lower heart. And thanks to its appearance as the circulatory system, Paleblood appears to be both aptly named and a great one. We find the corpse of Kaz on the shore of the fishing hamlet. Her otherworldly appearance and unusually large size would lead us to think that Kaz is a great one, but those are more instinctual responses that aren't firmly rooted in evidence. Stronger evidence comes from dialogue. The baneful chanters are unseen figures whose whispered mantra can be overheard within the fishing hamlet. The lengthy poem that they repeat serves as a historical record of the events of the hamlet. Their dialogue tells us, "Cause we have beckoned." This term beckoned is the same as we find on the lore note in the lecture building that states, "The moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates, Paleblood." This seems to line up with the text of the moon rune, which states, "The great ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon." This is modest evidence that Kaz was a great one who was beckoned by the inhabitants of the fishing hamlet and then was killed by the scholars of Bergenworth, whom the hamlet priest refers to as blasphemous murderers. In the base game, Mikolash mentions Kaz by name during the cutscenes preceding his boss fight, but we can't really rely on this dialogue for much of anything. As Lance McDonald discovered in his mining of game data files, Abritus was originally named Kaz, and the moon presence was originally named successor to Abritus. This obviously undermines the integrity of what Mikolash mutters in his famous line, "Ah, Kaz, or some say Kazum, do you hear our prayers?" But what about Kaz's design? Does she meet our criterion? Even though it's difficult to get a full grasp of Kaz's anatomy because we can only see her body from one side, and she's a corpse, so we never see her in motion, signs still point to yes, that Kaz meets our standard. As we can see from an overhead view of Kaz's corpse, her body is in the shape of the phantasms that we find throughout the game, and especially within the caverns of the fishing hamlet. That's no surprise, but it's safe to say that they got their design, just like the Kaz parasite, from Kaz and not the other way around. And Kaz's design isn't just supposed to look like a phantasm or parasite. She's a massive representation of the womb. Credit to YouTuber BonfireVN, who has a neat video on the physiognomy of Kaz that I've linked in the description. If we examine Kaz from a bird's eye perspective, we can see that her body and the flow of her spine down her back is the exact same as the curvature of a human spine when shown from a lateral view. Using this same perspective, we can see that the bulk of the womb from whence the orphan emerges is in the correct anatomical location as a womb would be relative to the spine in a human body. So yes, Mother Kaz meets our standard. She too is designed primarily as a feature found within the human body. The orphan, of course, has the proportions of a fully formed man, but he wields his placenta as a weapon. We can see the placenta attached to the umbilical cord that wraps around the orphan's arm, over his back, and into his stomach at the belly button, just as it would be for a typical unborn child. While we could look to the placenta as our key piece of evidence and say, yes, the placenta is something found within the body, and this is our proof that the orphan is a great one, I don't think that's exactly right. Up to this point, we've seen that the Great Ones are designed almost in total as things found within the body. It's not just one small feature of their design. It's the primary feature, if not the entirety of their design. In this regard, the orphan of Kaz is no different. As a fetus or unborn child, the orphan itself is the thing found within the body. Its placenta is just a signature part of the whole fetus. When we take that into consideration, then absolutely, the orphan of Kaz is almost certainly a Great One. The remaining two beings on our list of potential Great Ones can't be subjected to this visual test. Murgo and Murgo's wet nurse aren't exactly viewable. Murgo is never truly seen, and Murgo's wet nurse is invisible. Only the outline of the draping shawl gives us any indication of the wet nurse's size and shape. This might be an indication that these two entities aren't Great Ones after all, but just like the formless Udden, there could be something else going on with them. So let's put them aside for now and return to them later. The obvious question at this point, of course, is why? Why are the Great Ones designed as things found within the body? And why do I keep using this specific phrase, found within the body? If you've been following this series and seen how the Victorian medical metaphor has been used, then you probably have a good idea. We'll answer both of these questions in the second part of this two-part episode.